prepared a little, some writing to share with you today. Because of the delay in the train arriving, I might not be able to share everything, so I might stop at a certain point and then we can maybe talk about some of the ideas around it, because I feel although some of this subject matter is something obviously that has come from a very deeply personal experience, I feel that it can be experienced much broader, in the same way that the performance piece that you participated in allowed for a quite a broad shared experience, although it's in one single act and everybody has connotations of this single act. So in the same way, I think this paper might, I hope, reach, although it's anchored in research and feelings from a Vietnamese diaspora, I hope that it will resonate with everybody. So it's a piece of research that I've been looking at in the last couple of years in terms of how to unpack certain feelings, transmitted memory, experiences that affect a person who exists as part of a diaspora, and what that means in the contemporary, in history, and going forward. This paper is called Reconfiguring the Value of Sadness, and it's very self-explanatory in its title. Sadness as a feeling, as a state of being, has always interested me, because it feels like I received a very, very developed experience that transmitted from my parents, and of course some of my experience, and that feeling was very much anchored in a sadness, but it wasn't a sadness that I felt crippled by. It was actually a sadness that I felt quite empowered by. But to say that in the same word feels a little bit sort of incongruous, I think. But if I can share with you this, and then perhaps I might find a good time to stop if we're running out of time, and we can speak about it a little bit more. So, the loss of my father dismantled a fundamental knowledge. It triggered the beginning of an examination into the epistemology of sadness, the desire to commune in togetherness of sadness, and how this has and will continue to affect my thinking and practice. In this following text, I will introduce ideas around the proposal for reconfiguring sadness in the diaspora community, with focus on my personal experiences in the Vietnamese diaspora. Reconfiguring sadness is beginning. I'm particularly interested in how sadness can be reconfigured to open up the following ideas. Reconfiguring epistemic sadness, depathologizing mourning and melancholia, sadness as a site of productive knowledge, empowerment and agency, sadness as sharing ground to promote social togetherness through performance, memory and genealogy, the positive transmission of sadness, reflections on how reconfigured ideas of sadness manifest and will continue to manifest in the way that I make my performance work. And as you can see, most of the performance work is very much about an invitation. It's one act, it's usually quite simple, a simple scenario, but it's about an invitation, it's not about the sort of pressure to participate. So to begin with, I want to introduce some ideas around reconfiguring sadness and cognizance beyond the epistemic ideas of suffering. And I draw on my personal experiences as a refugee person to assert that sadness is active rather than static, that we live with it and we live on with it, the pain we feel today becoming the strength we have tomorrow. I argue that sadness has the capacity to create productive knowledge and narratives to mobilize agency and activate visibility. Throughout, I will share reflections on how this research is informing my current and future thinking, and including my making. If I could start with a reference to Sigmund Freud, in his 1917 essay, Mourning Melancholia, he presents a distinction between two scenarios of being and feeling through a successful and failed scenario. So his scenario is a successful resolution of loss and a failed resolution of loss. So Freud begins by defining his ideas of mourning as a reaction to the loss of a person, a country, or liberty. He continues to state that extended mourning results in producing undesirable pathological disposition. Consequently, this theory has encouraged an uncritical use of epistemic ideas of sadness as a blanket term that often smothers the intricate structures of mourning. So, I mean, I think it's sort of quite clear that what I'm trying to say, that although we use sadness as sort of an umbrella term, that when we start to sort of disseminate and unpack it, it means so much more. Let us look at sadness away from the epistemic idea that Freud has laid down. Firstly, I challenge the assumptions of epistemic sadness to argue that prolonged sadness should not be considered pathological. I assert that sadness performs a crucial mechanism in reconstructing loss as productive knowledge and to improve life and community. By removing epistemic notions of sadness, we reduce the continued repression and dominance of vulnerable groups and destigmatize the suffering of others to establish positive, generative and restorative encounters. I propose that the construct of reconfigured sadness is much dependent on intergenerational relationships, memory recall, identity, culture and politics. To share in sadness is not an attempt to cause a nihilistic sense of desperation or depression, but is to take power in pathos, in feeling what another feels, and in that becoming aware of what sadness a person embodies. To become aware is to share a fundamental collective consciousness and to empower communities who have experienced histories of loss, displacement or dispossession, to feel that they can harness that experience as power, as knowledge. It is unethical to judge mourning on successful stages of getting over. Like all modern activities based on targets, we are expected to move through loss in key steps. And to not achieve this is to demonstrate a failure. Professor of philosophy Susan Bryson's studies into ethics and human values are particularly relevant to this point that I place here. Bryson explores effects of trauma on culture, looking at study results that reveal people regularly indicate that there should be defined mourning periods. So, for example, people should be able to get over, we should expect people to be able to get over certain types of mourning in a designated time period. And once this period has passed, then usually society doesn't have the empathy or patience to continue to listen or to empathize with this sadness. And just to sort of explore that point a little bit more, I quote Bryson here. As a society, we live with the unbearable by pressuring those who have been traumatized to forget and by rejecting the testimonies of those who are forced by fate to remember. As individuals and as cultures, we impose arbitrary terms on memory and in the recovery of trauma. For example, a century, say for slavery, 50 years perhaps for the Holocaust, a decade or two for the Vietnam War, several months of mass rape or serial murder. And I mean, this sounds very radical, but this is actually based on studies with subjects, when she asked them what they thought was a personal time that they would consider people should be able to get over certain trauma. So in my opinion, it's alarming to see studies that demonstrate the rejection of understanding and empathy in human conditions of mourning by stipulating a normal period for getting over sadness. This unfortunately perpetuates the damaging assertion that prolonged sadness is pathological. Again, I quote Judith Butler, which I feel this quote that I use here is particularly poignant and affecting to the act of mourning and how we can use mourning to understand past and future. Quote Judith Butler, that mourning might be completed as a paradox. The past is irrecoverable, and the past is not the past. The past is a resource for the future, and the future is a redemption for the past. Loss must be marked, and it cannot be represented. Loss fractures representation itself, and loss precipitates its modes of expression. I wonder if David, what do you think? Shall I continue, or shall I stop it for a minute to have a chat about some of those ideas? Because the next part of the essay goes into talking about an essay that discusses an idea called racial melancholia, and what racial melancholia is and how it affects diaspora communities. I don't know.
I think it might be nice to have a shorter period of time to talk.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
Lots of interesting information you mentioned before.
Yeah, I feel like there was quite a lot of information, whether we should try to share some of that before
I think because I'm personally still in the really like slow atmosphere of the performance.
Sure, yeah.
So I think we really might slow down now for a bit. And thank you for the thoughts you shared with us. Just technically we have like 40 minutes left.
Yeah.
Which is not
I
much.
know.
So it will be hard to slow down. But I think we might do that. I don't know if we would like to eat something to...
This was brilliant. I can see some,
I was more interested about pop culture and sadness and how we see like in recent years how sadness and pathos really like jumped in charts like in pop music and we see that we do share some kind of dark euphoria in a sense, which is really interesting for me, that in a sense like I sometimes feel listening to lyrics but also the sound design of albums, of LPs, that a lot of artists are somehow dealing with sadness with a sense of euphoria, like maybe it's similar to what you said, like an empowering kind of sadness, which I really share with you. That I'm also kind of person that when I feel sad, I think it's a certain kind of energy for me that gives me new optics to things and certain kind of distance from things, but also at the same time it's really pulls me in. So I have distance, but at the same time I'm really intensively inside of the thing. So it's really weird kind of feeling for me.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned music and sadness, because I am going to spend 3 months in Vietnam at the end of the year researching a particular type of music called nhạc vàng, bolero, and ideas of empowerment, euphoria and sadness, but also really using this form of music, Vietnamese music, to explore the relationship between Vietnam, homeland, and Vietnam's diaspora over the last 40 years. Because this music, nhạc vàng, has been very, I think, very important in mapping the complex relationship between Vietnam and its diaspora after the war, and how it has sort of used it as a tool to disguise the complexities and relationships socially and politically between the two communities. So it's interesting you mention music, because of the 3-month research project I'll be doing in Vietnam about particularly populist music and how that can be used as a tool for examining social political sort of structures. But also I think sadness is interesting as a tool, as a research ground, because although everybody relates to it in some way, and everybody can say, of course, I've experienced this sadness, I've experienced loss, in some way, I think it's important to recognize that sadness manifests itself very differently in different communities, different groups, depending on the historical experience that has come through that. For example, the reason why I talk about sadness as pathology and almost this guilt of feeling sadness is precisely because as a refugee, when you are accepted into a country, you are expected to assimilate, and you are always expected to be very grateful. It's constant. This is constant. Why are you being like this, feeling like this? You left this horrible country of yours, and now you're here, and we are giving you all of this. So why are you still sad? And actually, I've come up against that a lot in terms, even in the art industry, actually, and just performance making. The question is why? Like, it's not such a cool thing to think about anymore, feeling sad. Everything else is much more about breaking other boundaries. But for me, it's always been something that's really been really interesting, because it's been repressed. I haven't been allowed to explore that sadness. And so the sadness comes from a different place. And hence, now I realise that actually through that history and that sadness and that transmitted memory from Vietnam, it's actually so empowering once you realise that it is, you're allowed for it to be empowering. Yeah.
This program also empowering just to kind of encourage others
Yes.
to participate in sharing the sadness, and sharing their in their community, or just between communities.
Yeah.
Did you also have experiences of between different diaspora communities, like sharing this?
I have spoken to, there's, it mainly has been the Southeast Asia and East Asia communities, but because in London there is a big, there's quite a diverse community of Turkish, Indian, and there's, so in all of them, and perhaps it all manifests differently, and as David has already mentioned, it's not just present or visible or exists in a diaspora community or people who are displaced, or we all feel it in some form, but it's in most cultures, and particularly in this modern culture, it's not enabling. It's not something that you put on, everybody has to be super happy all of the time, and you have to look tanned and glorious and just amazing and just all of the time. It has to be constant, but I feel like, in fact, those moments, those moments of just a longing, like Burning to the End is about knowing that this match is going to finish burning. Like it will burn very bright in the beginning, but it will inevitably end. And so it's just a question of how we might relate to that that loss and acceptance of that loss, I guess, But actually being together and doing it, and actually going through it and doing this very simple action, it feels quite euphoric, when you're able to just sit down and watch this. I hope, anyway.
Can I ask? Did you have in mind some particular emotion that the performers should feel when they are holding the matches? Or do you ask the people afterwards what they were feeling, and it mostly was always something different, or did you have some similar answers maybe?
Yeah, I think this is the second time I've seen it public.
Okay.
So it's only been performed once in London, in Chelsea. So when this setup was slightly different actually, because usually when I invite somebody to perform it, I've written a little scenario. So it feels like the stage directions of a play, but without a character. So you don't have to be anybody. So I send this usually to the performer, and it tells them what, just the instructions, but it doesn't tell them what they should be doing. It's totally improvised, or it doesn't really tell them what they should be feeling. The name itself is so didactic and just mundane. It's Burning to the End. Anybody can interpret that in any way, and so actually the idea that everybody interprets it differently, or they will strike the match at a different speed, they will hold it differently, they will get into the act, in a different way. That's what I'm interested in, rather than specifying what it is that they should be feeling. Hence even the invitation. The invitation is just a chair and a match, the matchbox is today, and really it should just be, if you feel like you and I think it just breaks down the idea of what, an art performance, and you're standing here and watching, because one of the key instructions to the invited performers is not a performance. It's really just an interaction. It's a sharing. Don't make it a spectacle. You don't have to perform it. It's for you, and whatever the true feeling that you're feeling at that moment, the other people, hopefully the viewers or participants, will engage with that and find it interesting. But I don't usually ask people what they feel, because I feel like I can experience that. I can see it without having them to explain the word in words again.
This was really important for me, like you mentioned before, that it's not the scenario of a performance, but sort of kind of being together, and I really felt this intensely. Like we are side by side, and it was a special meeting because we know each other more or less. So we've been together lots of times, and now it was sort of kind of shift in our relation that we've been together really otherwise now for a few moments and just enjoying the sound. The sound was really important for me. So the musicality of the performative action and the being together was really intense, because I know that somebody is scratching, the match, and I really didn't know who exactly is the person, but I was thinking about people sitting next to me, and maybe that's because I know more or most of you, so that might be really like the intimacy in the performance piece, so it might be really, really different when the set of people is different. And I also wanted to add something to the topics you've been discussing before Marek asked this question, that you've been telling that sadness, it's not cool. As we can, or as far as we can, like analyze pop culture nowadays, so I think sadness is really cool. Opposed to what you said, because we can feel it in fashion, we can feel it in music, we can feel it in movies or Netflix series. So in the sense, there is a pop cultural element of sadness which is also capitalized, financialized, of course, and not like felt through. And I think that sadness is more of a taboo than an anti-cool thing. Like the first thing, if I say at my family that I'm sad, there's a huge amount of I feel a huge amount of guilt, like why am I supposed to feel sad when all of us have our problems, and I feel that my family is not like prepared to get or to give me time to think it through, or just to ask a simple question like why, or tell me, or if you would like to tell me why you are sad, just please elaborate. If not, it's absolutely okay, and just take your time. It's about like, oh, you can't be sad, it's Christmas, so fuck it, just have the gifts and count the stuff. And I think it's more of a unhonesty with ourselves.
And you also feel you always have to justify sadness opposed to happiness. Like nobody's like, why are you happy? It's but which would be the same legitimate question actually. Why are you happy? This is really something which is really irritating when you're in this kind of situation.
And I guess also the question, if we think about the question and asking and the questioning of a feeling, that where does it come from? What is the root? And that's also really interesting, because that is quite revealing. Does anybody from this side want to add anything?
I have more of a question, like a more general question. You said that different ethnic groups or different communities and different nations have different sense of mourning and sadness. So I was just wondering if Vietnam has some unique perception of sadness. I was just watching a very long documentary on Vietnam War on Netflix. It's great, actually. It has 20 hours.
I've seen it.
So, and you can see that the Vietnamese nation was through a lot for a very long time. Like many nations went through a lot, but Vietnamese went through a lot. So, what kind of heritage did it leave, or did it affect the perception of sadness?
I think that's a very big question. I would say one thing about the documentary.
I'm really curious about it.
You've seen the whole.
Yeah.
I have
the whole 20 hours.
It's good. It attempts to give a different perspective of the Vietnam War. Unlike most of the documentaries that come from a very skewed, Americanized sort of presentation of the Vietnam War, it interviews Vietnamese war veterans, women, but the soundtrack, I feel it could have been a little bit more varied.
Yeah, it's very American.
It's very American. It's like, there was really good Saigon rock going on that time. It was really, really good, and there's none of that there. So I'm sure they could have got a better musical. But in terms of mourning, melancholia, sadness, I feel like there is a deep, deep-seated relationship with this feeling and the Vietnamese people. And it isn't perhaps just about the contemporary history of war, loss, and trauma, and the tragic events that Vietnam as a country has gone through. There is something in the poetry of it, sadness. Like the Japanese have a term for it called mono no aware. I might be pronouncing that badly, but it is an appreciation of loss or impermanence. So it's actually celebrating the fact that we must appreciate or feel intensely the thing that will leave us very suddenly. And so I don't think it's just the Vietnamese, but it does. There are other cultures that have this, but I feel like there is a deep-seated human need to communicate sadness as a sense of belonging, as a sense of touching you in a place that you will remember, with sadness as a sort of I use sadness, but I'm sure that there's a better word. Maybe we need to make a new word up that isn't so loaded with, but I think it comes from the poetry, it comes from the landscape, it comes from even the tonal sounds of the string instruments, and the linguistics. It's very poetic language. So I think there's something in that, combined with the contemporary, the modern periods of history that have been really traumatic. But I think, it's a big question, and it's definitely something that, I'm really interested to explore a little bit more, because I feel it, I can sense it, I inhabit it, but there's so many different facets that I'm not quite sure which, So this research paper is just like, I feel like the beginning of.
So do you feel when you are somewhere abroad, when you're in, let's say, Germany, do you feel like all Germans don't have this melancholia embedded so in such a way, or?
It's different.
Yeah.
I can really sense it. And you can only sense it if you embody it. There is a different relationship to sadness, melancholia, empathy, pathos. Yeah.
I think I don't know why is it, but I think here in this area it would be Hungarians who are so melancholic. I don't even speak Hungarian, a little bit, but from reading even translations of Hungarian literature, I feel the melancholy there much more than Czech literature, for example.
But it's interesting why it's there in the first place. It's a strain of
I think it's a different kind of sense of pathos, or based on different kind of platform. Maybe it's more about like enclosing the Hungarian culture and linguistics with Slavic languages, and maybe that's also a certain kind of like attention for the Hungarian culture, which is really pathetic, and really not pathetic, but lots of there is a huge amount of pathos in myths, rituals, and also contemporary politics and culture. And we can maybe elaborate on this someday, because it's really an interesting topic, but also we have it also here in Slovakia, and I'm like mixed somehow, because I'm half Hungarian, half Slovak, or I'm like the part of Hungarian minority in Slovakia, which is not like an obvious diasporic experience or identity, but there's certain kind of traumatic events as well in my childhood. But it's a different kind of topic. But I wanted to more or tell more about the binarities between the ultra-rational enlightenment kind of historical platform we do have for our notions and optics of thinking, and maybe the Asian ones, which I personally romanticize a lot, and I don't want to be like exoticizing things, but in certain kind of, for example, poetry or philosophy, I really do feel this gap between those practices of thinking when we talk about, for example, sadness or mourning, because here I think that death is a really good example, because I think we really do have lost the narrative of death. Since Christianity is not that much influential nowadays, the only thing we do have connected with death is fight for not dying. It's just connected to chirurgical tools and doctors and nurses running around, and everybody's just fighting for your life. And there's like nothing after it. We phenomenologically enclose our lives just into the moments we are here, and afterwards there's nothing. So we do not even talk about it, and we do not even think about it. So it's a taboo as well. Like the aging process and disappearing or dying is really a huge taboo in our society. And I think this is or from my experience, just a few weeks and months in Vietnam, I did have an experience of people living more like interconnected between different layers in society, not just connected to the age, but also the financial background. But maybe it's just more my romantic, view on the society. But this was interesting for me really much, and I was talking to a lot of people, and some of them told me that it's really important for them to live with all the generations and also the younger ones in households together. But some of them told me that it's really exhausting, and they really want to live in big cities, fast life without the family. So I do not know if there is a binarity between those life views, but and certainly not, because there's none binarities in life at all. But I think this is different.
I think what you talk about is interesting, because I think in terms of that structural social structure and having intergenerational family members living in the same. In the West, we don't really live like that anymore. In Vietnam, most people don't want to live like that anymore, because it is quite a pressurized environment. But what we lose from not having a structure like that is that we lose the contact between transmitted knowledge and memory between generations, and that includes the closeness of death, because if you live with your grandmother or you live without, you can see the journey of life through her, and then there's a baby who's just starting its life in the same environment every day. So I think that's something that perhaps there is the lacking, the absence of intergenerational opportunity to transmit is quite true to perhaps what you're saying about how we lack a space to talk about losing and death and Actually, when I'm sad, sometimes I get really angry. I get so angry, and it's the source of being able to like fire, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like you make me sad, you're gonna get fire, really.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, so I feel like that is also really important, that it's, you know, to be able to empathize with a certain sadness, or it gives you another type of fight for survival. You were talking about like that, you know? I think that's also really important, that it isn't always, it's not just blah, but it's about how do we have a very sort of defined set of emotions in a spectrum. Yes, we may have nuances in between, but how do we continue to like expand those sets of emotions, like happiness? How can happiness be like something else beyond just being, oh, you're happy because you got a promotion or whatever it is, you know? But how can we kind of reconfigure those feelings now? Because those emotions don't stay static. They move with the times. They move with our you know, ambitions and aspirations and etc. etc. They don't remain the same. Happiness 100 years ago isn't the same as happiness today, for example. And I think the same for sadness, and the same for, you know, all sorts of other. So I think it's really important that we constantly challenge what it means to say, oh, I'm happy, or I'm sad, or she is sad because I know she's sad because she is, you know, whatever. Yeah, but I think it's a good exercise just to be able to continuously do that and not set these binaries in life by just assuming that they remain the same. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I just want to check the time.
Yeah.
Oh, we do have 23 minutes left.
Not
much,
so much time to talk.
Maybe we can like just decide together whether we would like to continue talking or listen to Moi's texts. So I think it's up to all of us to decide somehow. I don't want to like raise hands or whatever. Just give us some signal if you would like to eat more, talk more, drink water, or.
So this is a vegetarian.
Yeah.
Has this got tofu in it then?
Oh no,
I think
eggs.
no.
Eggs. How are they? They good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the shrimps.
Yeah, that's up. This is a shrimp one, right?
Yeah.
So is this Vietnamese, you would say like this typical Vietnamese sadness, is it passed on towards younger generations? And in what way? Is it through pop culture then, or?
It's through culture, yeah. It's through populist music. It's definitely all of this idea that I have of sadness, but it's passed on from listening to music like Nhạc Vàng, and you know that it's definitely transmitted in that way. Of course, it's also transmitted through family memory and recollection. But I feel like because there are so many parts of my personal history that are gaps, that I feel like I question whether I really remember that moment when I had measles on the boat leaving Vietnam to Hong Kong, or is it because it has been transmitted to me by my parents, because they told me you nearly died, so you should be grateful for them because you know.
They also made you a hero.
Yeah, but I can actually, like, when I think about it, I think, oh, actually, I can almost see the environment. I can see the light. I can feel the sweat. I can, you know, and you know, when you have a history like this that's very patchy and very sort of it becomes really interesting when you can't decipher between what it is has been transmitted and what it is you actually remember. So that's also something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of, like, you know, the ideas that are sort of rolling around in my head now, and I try to go on feeling like I know that I have we've been traveling back and forth to Vietnam since they allowed the guild back into Vietnam in the late 80s, early 90s, because we weren't allowed to return before then. So since then, we've been going back quite a lot, and I'm from the north, and I was born in a small village near Hong Gai, which is, the most famous sort of area around there is Vinh Hạ Long, the Halong Bay. So very close to that, my father's family were fishermen. They would sail around the lime rock mountains and fish. And you know, it was my father didn't really sort of give me lots of stories about the village and him growing up. He didn't really want to talk very much about it, to be honest. But when I travelled back then, was able to sort of understand and have some cognizance about what it was to be Vietnamese. You know, it was all on feeling rather than sort of academic knowledge or theory or history that so from this day I still tend to just go on that, like what is the feeling? What is the feeling of this corner of this street? What is the feeling of, and then from there perhaps do a bit more research into why, and perhaps what was how that sort of feeling has manifested itself in me. Is it through transmitted memory, or is it through something I've concocted in my my head as well? Yeah.
And don't you see any connection between being sad and being not productive? And that's why the culture and the society, because when you are sad or when you feel melancholy, you tend to do nothing, so you are not productive. So melancholy is not productive, and in that sense it's forbidden. If you can make something out of it, then it's okay. And that's why you have limits in time. Like you have 21 days off from your work when you're allowed not to be productive. In that sense, you have like a week when you can be sad for something, or a month, or whatever you said, because then society gives you, okay, you can be sad a month, but after that you have to keep producing. So I see the direct connection. Being sad is actually being anti-system. In that sense, it's like that's why we did the taboo out of sadness, because it's not productive and that's not acceptable.
Absolutely, and that's what I do go on to talk about in my text, the idea of productivity and what is accepted in terms of being sad in society, and how actually embracing the agency of sadness is actually an act of protest. And that is interesting in itself, I feel. For example, like you say, a lot of the pieces of work that I made as a body that surrounds the research of this text looks at Walter de Maria's idea of meaningless work. What does it mean to be productive? I mean, after I lost my father, I spent a year feeling I was doing nothing. I couldn't do anything. I was paralyzed into just nothing. I would wake up in the morning, brush my teeth and go sit in the garden and just watch his plants, or I'd watch the washing line or watch a light. And I felt like I was doing nothing. But after coming to the end of that, I just realized that actually it was more productive a year than I've ever had in my memorable, my remembered sort of adult life. And it did give me an access to questioning what is it that society terms as productive, and in being productive, you're given value as an individual or as a human being or as a diaspora group. You have to represent value. You have to represent productivity and give something. But we need it by like you say, thinking about sadness and allowing sadness to give you a chance to stop feeling that you have to produce. It's really interesting because it does allow you to question what it means to be productive. And again, it goes back to the idea of happiness, sadness, and how these words are so active. They change with the way that we live and what we're expected to be, and how we're expected to produce, and the pressures. And hence, sadness is not there's no place for sadness in this modern society, because the minute people say, they're sad, like you say, people feel like things stop. You're no longer as useful because you'll no longer be as productive. So I think the parallel discourse is really, really interesting in terms of that, because it does allow us to look at the way that we have been formed and are informed of our position in society and our position with each other. Because the feeling that I had empathy from my friends, close friends, for like the first 2 or 3 months. The close friends. And then after that, I couldn't expect that from them anymore. And they couldn't give it anymore. And everybody just thought, you need to just, what are you doing? But that's just as an individual. But when you look at it, when you sort of take that idea of expectation and what is productive and what makes a productive member of society, and you look at it in the scope of a diaspora community or displaced people, or in terms of the refugee crisis that we've recently been and still are experiencing, how does that affect a group of people like that? If we don't have the empathy to say, actually, because the minute you're accepted into a country, you're expected to assimilate, you're expected to be productive immediately, but productive as the society expects you to be productive. And a lot of these people can't. And they can't straight away, and they'll never be as you expect them to be, because, and that was also something that I experienced being part of the Vietnamese diaspora in the UK. That sort of sense of, expectation and being productive and being a valued member of society and being, the model, immigrant. So, yeah, it's a really very interesting topic that is much more far-reaching than we initially proposed or think.
Intersectional in really lots of ways.
Yeah.
And I think it connects the whole society. It's not just about certain kind of groups of people or collectives or whatever, but I think really is productivity and how productivity is affected by sadness or different affective diseases, for example, chronic diseases, whatever it might be, which affects your productivity. It's a certain kind of taboo in the society, and I think we need to deal with that in different layers.
It's really interesting in terms of thinking about sadness and expanding it beyond just that word, and thinking about exhaustion. And in our society, and because of the pressure to produce and the pressure to be productive, we have to be constantly online. We have to be constantly engaged. But what does it mean to be engaged when you're exhausted? And most of us are, constantly exhausted. And then if we're feeling that exhaustion, then we're no longer as productive, in quotes.
I want to ask about the word depression. If you see more like similarities or differences between sadness and depression, because I think that in our society, yes, sadness is something which is taboo, but I think maybe in last years it's quite popular, or I think that we are not so afraid to use the word that I'm depressed, and a lot of people around me, young generation, is somehow it's strange in some way, but they are like proud to say that I'm on medication because I'm depressed, I'm exhausted. So if you see there's some similarities.
Because I'm so productive that I'm depressed.
Well, I think that's also.
In this case, it's okay.
And it became somehow cool, I think, between some kind of generation. This young, a lot of people I meet that they are like, oh, I'm still depressed, and
Yeah, I do. I'm sorry, just want to add something because from the really similar context. And then you're also, of course, invited to add something and enjoy your meal.
Thank you.
I do meet a lot of people with different kinds of neurological or psychological on the normativities, let's say. But I don't think it's about being cool, but it's more about being open in the sense that I think it's, or at least for me, or as I see it, it's more okay to say that you do have some kind of problems, and that they're not considered to be just problems anymore, but we consider them to be part of our lives, and we can talk about them openly. And that's maybe a movement which sometimes may appear like we catchy or cool or whatever, but I think, or I'm glad about it. I'm not glad that people do have problems or instabilities, but I'm really happy that we can share these feelings one with each other, and that we do share emotions a lot, at least in our cultural practitioners communities. And of course there is a problem of fetishizing these topics, but yeah, it's not that simple, I think.
Yeah, of course.
I think when you bring also, when we bring pharmaceuticals into it, it's a very different, beast, because most of the most influential and capitalistic corporations are pharmaceutical corporations, and they have tentacles in every part of our society. And whether we think of it as being perhaps open or progressive, in fact, if we really can stand back and think critically about this, all of these behavioural patterns have been somehow produced for us. Because then it's an acceptable way of behaving in society. For example, people can say they have depression because now they have the medication to say they have depression. But this has all been sort of, it's a construct, and it's a construct that perhaps we didn't even decide on as a society. These corporations who need to make money from our, ailments or whatever it is that we need, they have constructed methods and situations whereby we can buy into it. So I think yes, of course it's good for us to be open to be able to talk about these things, but the other thing is to think about how, I think David, you mentioned it, right? How these corporations can capitalize on the only thing that we can keep for ourselves now, which is genuine human feeling. They're constantly trying to capitalize on these things, and I think it will be very important for us to consistently be quite vigilant when it comes to situations like this, that we aren't being manipulated, which I feel like, in every situation that we participate in society, these constructs have been made, and they haven't always been made from the grassroots, from community. They've been made as a commodity. So sadness will become a commodity, depression will become a commodity, all of these things, but I think
it did already, I think.
Yeah,
at least in music.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, music, film, photography, any sort of, there is a capitalization of that, and I feel that is more problematic than it being cool, or being, the capitalization of these vulnerabilities, perhaps.
And in our space we must add to it also, in Central Europe we must add to it also in the question of politics. The communist regime, there was push on happiness, and sadness was something like not very into this political.
And also productivity. As a communist, sort of.
In communist era, it was not a question of productivity. It was a very unproductive way of everybody has a job, but not everybody is working.
Yeah, but everybody has to be seen to be productive.
And I think it didn't change that much.
Yeah.
Or it changed, but
It's a strange combination of this approach with that approach we have talked right now.
Today it's even, I think, in few cases, even more bizarre. We produce like hundreds of thousands of things nobody uses. You know, so it's not that easy. Like we can say after regime changes, everything will be better in some aspect of life. It's really like really a complex question, and of course, productivity we can research throughout really different kinds of optics and ideologies and philosophies, and I didn't have an answer for that, of course. But I really do think that nowadays situation is much more like or much less transparent in the sense that all of us work really like non-stop, let's say, in the sense that we are available all the time. So we want to be really productive, but we are exhausted and unproductive at the same time, and we didn't have the time to think it through, to step back and to share these thoughts together. So I'm personally a bit like lost in it, and I really need a time to think it through, and these are the occasions when we really maybe have a chance to slow down for a while and just share thoughts and emotions as well.
But I started to think to myself, because so we're all exhausting ourselves because we're so with the pressure to perform and be not just one thing but be a million other things, right? So I started to think to myself, what would help me justify slowing down when I needed to slow down? And I went on an artist residency where there were 10 artists, and we were from different disciplines, theatre makers, writers, performers, and we were put together in one week in a really beautiful place in the country, in the UK, to think about our work in parallel to what is happening with climate change. But climate change and the intersections of climate change. So we're talking about maybe racism, gender inequality, poverty, so all of the intersections that climate change and capitalism help to sort of promote. And I thought to myself, well, actually, if I'm sad, that's my little bit of resistance to capitalism. If I sleep, because I make another piece of work where we sleep publicly in a public space, and we don't do anything that night. We sleep and we do a lot of things, but in public's eyes, we're not doing anything. But the idea that we're sort of radicalizing space with an intimate act and supposedly not doing anything it was really empowering. It felt really good to be able to do that, but also it gave us a sort of impetus to say, actually, we're doing this because we want to make a resistance against capitalism and the way that the regime is sort of heading and making us buy and make, when the world is saying, stop, please stop, you can't keep doing this anymore. So in a way, it allowed me a justification to say, actually, I'm making a piece of work with people together, and at the same time, we're sort of protesting in a soft way, in our own way, against climate change and capitalism by just stopping. Because when we sleep, we don't need to buy anything, we don't need to eat, and usually it's just we have sleeping bags on the floor and we're just together. And then the idea of sadness and productivity, as you mentioned. I wonder whether, like, if we wanted to, we could all make some like manifesto about that. We stop because we're saving the world and we're saving the climate. Because
that's why we created this place, the slowness to
exactly. So
against the speeding. Society is so speeding, and we are against it.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm really sad, but I think we need to close.
But a good sad.
It's good day.
Yeah.
A good sad.
Good to be a good
Yeah, good sadness. No, this is a great sadness. I'm feeling really, really sad. I feel it's really brilliant to meet you all. Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm so sorry that we can only be here such short. I hope you can come back and do something
It might
more.
be really beautiful.
Yeah, it'd be really great. Or if you're ever in London, please do contact me anytime. I'd love to see your practice and see some of your photographs and what you're doing. Yeah, it'd be really amazing to see what you're making and share some thoughts and maybe connect you with some Vietnamese photographers in London also. You can see what they're doing. But a pleasure, really. Like that was like the best thing that's happened in a long time. Your hospitality and it's been really brilliant and beautiful. Thank you.
We really thank you
Thank
for
you.
coming.